This talk will introduce the course level metrics assessment tool for oak woodlands, but I also hope it provides a good general introduction and generates some enthusiasm for oak woodland conservation and restoration. I need to acknowledge Ryan O'Connor, Amy Staffen, and Matt Zine with Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Natural Heritage Conservation, and Brian Miner with the Nature Conservancy in Wisconsin. They were my co-authors on this, and they brought me in on this project. Working with them was a lot of fun, and I'm sad that we're wrapping it up. I also need to acknowledge the Brander and Rundblad Research Fellowship Program through the Milwaukee Public Museum. Its support contributed to much of my contribution to this effort. And I should also recognize the landowners that granted us access, people that joined us in the field for discussions and provided review of draft course level metrics documents. I also need to acknowledge the Nature Conservancy in Michigan, the United States Forest Service, and NatureServe for concept development, the development of assessment tools rooted in ecological integrity concepts, so course level metrics. It's not something that we came up with, it's something that we've adapted to oak woodland ecosystems in Wisconsin. I don't have an outline slide. I'm going to start out with a brief introduction to oak woodlands, a little bit of discussion about how one might determine whether or not oak woodland was likely historically present and an appropriate restoration target. Then I'll talk a little bit about why develop this assessment tool. And then I'll go through the course metrics sort of one at a time and talk a little bit about how to actually implement that assessment in the field. So what is an oak woodland? Well, this is a picture taken in Walworth County, Wisconsin, that shows what I would consider to be kind of an archetypal upper Midwestern or Wisconsin oak woodland. And of course you can see the trees, you can see the oak trees in this image, but what I also want you to take away from this is that continuous sort of grassy, sedgy, herbaceous vegetation that grows throughout, and the dappled light conditions, sort of the bright conditions of this woodland. And to give you a better idea of how this is stitched together, this is a picture taken at the same site on the same day under that sort of mostly white oak canopy. And you can see that there's this high level of diversity at a small scale under those bright conditions. You can see that there are especially native sedges, and there's common wood rush there, another graminoid sort of stitched throughout. But there are also a lot of forbs or wildflowers in this high quality remnant site. And if you're good at sort of identifying vegetative things, you might notice the sky blue aster down in the lower right. And the point I'd like to make about that is that these are brighter systems, and they don't become dark after the oak trees leaf out. They continue to be bright through the season, and they support a flora and everything supported by that flora that actively grows and flowers throughout the growing season. Here I have a couple more images of remnant oak woodlands with that herbaceous vegetation. The top image was taken in Trempealeau County, Wisconsin, in the driftless area on a ridge. The bottom image was taken in a remnant on a knoll surrounded by peatland in Waukesha County, Wisconsin. And the point I'd like to make is that on the least degraded remnant sites, the herbaceous vegetation structure is generally low, regardless of the soil type and regardless of whether or not the sites are mesic or dry. There's also a fair amount of compositional similarity across those gradients and across a large geography. Remnants like these are very rare. They seem to be located on parts of the landscape that were minimally impacted by historical land use, in particular European fenced grazing and browsing practices. So in the driftless area, they tend to be located on ridge tops or steep slopes, separated from bottomlands by steep topography and rocky ledges, and from ridgetop farms by property lines with fences or distance. In glaciated southeastern Wisconsin, they are commonly located on these upland knolls surrounded by various types of peatlands, southern sedge meadows, marshes, shrub cars, open water even. So they weren't, presumably weren't very accessible during the growing season. Another layer to their rarity is the effect of fire exclusion on these systems. So in the absence of fire, just the accumulation of leaf litter over time will smother and thin out the herbaceous vegetation and degrade the herbaceous component of these communities. And the highest quality remnants seem to be located in these topographic positions where wind will export leaf litter. So on exposed slopes and ridge tops, or on these low knolls adjacent to peatlands, especially if some of those wetlands are open wetland types like sedge meadows in the glaciated southeast. These are characteristics from Hanbury and others describing open oak and pine systems that I think fit Wisconsin oak woodlands very well. They have a simple vertical structure, so they have this high oak canopy and a relatively open understory. It's not free of woody understory vegetation, but it's relatively open. And the canopies are closely spaced. These can be old growth systems. They're not merely a degradation of a darker forest type towards a more open community, nor are they a succession on its way to being a darker forest type or a more mesic forest type. They have their own kind of stability when they're a complete system. So the oaks have long lifespans that allow for a gradual opportunistic recruitment into the canopy from this advanced regeneration of oaks. So you can see in this picture, there are little white oaks just sort of biding their time there in the understory down towards the bottom of the picture. And with fire, those will resprout kind of indefinitely, and when there's a canopy opening, they can respond. They're bipartite systems with forest and grassland components. They have this grassy, sedgy, herbaceous vegetation with different graminoids and forbs, and it includes some that are actively growing both early and late in the season, as I mentioned before. And that has a structural similarity to grasslands and prairies. But as you saw in the pictures I showed earlier, there's also, at least in the higher quality remnants, a fair amount of compositional similarity between oak woodland herbaceous plants and the open prairie. There are species from the prairie that don't occur in woodlands, but there are quite a few that do. Restoration of oak woodlands is only really complete and successful when it takes into account both the woody elements and the overstory and that herbaceous vegetation. It's not just a matter of removing invasive brush or removing maybe maple from the overstory and things like that. The herbaceous vegetation itself, in addition to the oaks, is important for ecological process in these systems. So the contribution to flammable litter of that grassy, sedgy vegetation, in addition to the oak litter, the nutrient dynamics related to the old growth nature of that vegetation and the quality of its litter inputs, and the oak leaf litter in these systems, and the structure of that herbaceous vegetation, that lower structure associated with higher quality sites that doesn't provide a second layer of shading that excludes advanced oak regeneration, and the phenology of the herbaceous vegetation and the presence of species blooming throughout the season that supports not just consumers that are active early in the season, but communities that are active throughout the growing season. We're not talking about open savannas or oak openings. So you can see that structure in this picture, which are much brighter systems, or oak barrens, which are another type of open savanna, but on sand and more often with black oak or hills oak in Wisconsin. How do we know if a site was historically oak woodland? It's pretty difficult because there are mosaic communities that occur on the landscape with oak openings and oak barrens and prairies, and they grade into one another. And with fire exclusion and land use over the last couple of 100 years, things have changed on the landscape. But there are tools that we can use and evidence that we can piece together to give us a reasonably good idea about whether or not oak woodland was historically present. One of the really good tools is historical aerial photography. So in this image on the right, we have a 1941 air photo. So it's more than 80 years old now. And it shows that this knoll, and I know it's a knoll because I looked at the contour mapping, surrounded by wetlands, it has a canopy on it. And it has a pretty well-developed canopy. So we know there have been trees there for a while. If we look at it much more recently, so in 2020, we see it still has a canopy. This is a dormant season image, so it looks a little different. Zooming in on this, I could actually see that the sort of the spreading big limbs of the bigger trees had a lighter colored bark. They were probably white oak. And so that told me, oh, there's white oak here. It has probably been there for a while. And it's probably worth looking at. And also just looking through that dormant season image to the vegetation beneath, we can see the herbaceous vegetation and leaf litter. It's not congested with buckthorn, which looks dark, kind of like this in an air photo. This is glossy buckthorn in the wetland. Common buckthorn in uplands looks similar. So that tells us this is a site worth looking at. The original land survey notes are also a really good tool. So these are survey notes for this transect here going south to north. And I'll kind of skip down to the bottom. And first it refers to the previous transect's notes for the first half of the transect. So I had to pull that up. It's right here. And it's describing that land as rolling first-rate sandy bur oak plains. So probably a more open savanna type for the first half of the transect. But then the north half of the transect up here is described as hilly, broken, second-rate, white, and yellow, which often in this neck of the woods, this is Walworth County, Wisconsin, means black oak. So that's up here in the northern part of the transect where the topography, this is glacial topography, is much more broken or hilly. And we can't be sure that it means woodland, but white and black oak or just white oak is much more often associated with woodland. We can get a little bit of evidence from the bearing tree distances and those sorts of things, but there are some biases there that and there's not really a fine scale resolution there, so we couldn't be sure about any point maybe along the transect. But it suggests that oak woodland may have been present along the northern part of that transect, and lo and behold, that sort of archetypal oak woodland is located on this upland knoll right here. And there are other really nice remnants on some of these other upland knolls that are surrounded by wetland. And there's also white oak, red oak, and black oak on a lot of this sort of more broken topography that is not separated by wetlands. It was much more intensively used, in particular grazed. And so these sites don't retain their herbaceous vegetation underneath the oak. It's mostly just oak with buckthorn and bush honeysuckle underneath. The vegetation itself at these sites, taken as a whole, provides some evidence. So these are mosaic communities, and not only do they occur on these mosaics, but they also support elements of different communities. So oak woodlands support some prairie vegetation elements and some elements also of darker forests. But here are some examples of vegetation in historical oak woodland sites. And so we might see these more light-loving prairie associated elements like false toad flax. Might see species that really like the more dappled light or partial shade that you get in an oak woodland, things like Carolina vetch or starry campion. Or there are prairie species that when they occur in uplands like that more dappled light or maybe partial shade, like two-flowered cynthia, which is abundant in this image on the left. Robbins plantain is maybe a little bit of a weedier species, and it persists on sites maybe that were more heavily grazed in the past, but it also requires that low vegetation structure to persist, And it also persists where leaf litter accumulation in the absence of fire has not been too excessive. It's also a part of high quality woodland or herbaceous sods, but it's also more resistant to past disturbance. So those things taken together. So why develop an assessment tool? Well, one of the first reasons is that really high quality examples, the examples that retain sort of this intact herbaceous sod, are incredibly rare. And I would contend that they've undergone at least as much proportional loss as any other community type in the upper Midwest. But we still have a lot of sites that have been degraded. They still have their oak structure. They still have herbaceous structure. They've lost species or compositional elements have been thinned out, but they're perhaps very restorable. Then we have more degraded sites like this that have lost their herbaceous structure, lost much of their oak, and they're very invaded by exotic woody vegetation. Here there's a bunch of Asian bittersweet tangle. And so we need to be able to recognize these communities in sort of their different incarnations and perhaps restorability. But we're also losing sites, good sites, to development. So that archetypal site, a big chunk of it was developed to put in a boat launch. And I think it's important to recognize these communities and remnants of these communities as a whole. We often don't take that into account when sites are being assessed and we're weighing whether or not to develop them. We take into account individual rare and declining species oftentimes, but not the overall community of which they're part, which is crazy. And there were rare species at that site. They actually weren't taken into account. The incidental take was post hoc, but the oak woodland itself was not even a consideration. And so I think anything that helps us recognize individual natural community types and call them out is important. But they do support rare and declining species like this whippoorwill or kittentails or heartleaf skullcap. We fail often to recognize opportunities to restore oak woodlands, and sometimes we mistake them for other things. And I think some of this in Wisconsin goes back to the Vegetation of Wisconsin by Curtis. It doesn't call out oak woodland as a community type. It kind of gets lumped into southern dry forest and southern dry mesic forest, but it doesn't stand by itself. And so the site in the top picture is a site that back in the late 1930s had a continuous oak canopy, and the original land survey transect going through there was white oak and black oak. And I think maybe partly because it was oak, the decision was made to open it up, to make it something structurally more like an oak opening or an open oak savanna. But it's really been kind of a disaster, because what that opening has led to is just this eruption of non-oak woody vegetation, black cherry and box elder and a bunch of non-native stuff too, and an opportunistic kind of weedy herbaceous vegetation, things like clonal tall goldenrod and Canada thistle. But if we can recognize these sites before we start doing stuff, there's a lot of potential. And it's maybe not such a heavy lift to start bringing in a little more light by thinning out some of this understory woody vegetation, opening up around some of these remaining white oak, or here's a bur oak back here, trees. And if we've lost some of the herbaceous components, doing some targeted interseeding in these communities. Not as heavy a lift as doing like the big job of thinning this out, although maybe there's some return on the timber there. And man, recovering this and dealing with this eruption of problems now that this canopy has been thinned out excessively, I don't know if it's even worth it. So we want to be able to recognize oak woodlands sort of by all their different incarnations, the ranges of ways in which they maintain their quality, and the ranges of ways in which they've degraded. And to be able to separate out some of those different ways that oak woodlands manifest themselves in terms of sort of their overall physiognomy and what's going on with the herbaceous vegetation and the canopy and the woody vegetation. We want to be able to start to separate that out and develop goals for restoration based on where those communities are at on a case-by-case basis. And attach appropriate methods for their management to those goals and achieving those goals. And in these systems, it's almost always going to involve the frequent use of low intensity, dormant season, stabilizing surface fires. There are other assessment tools like floristic quality assessment, which I would recommend be used wherever the capacity is there. It's a valuable tool, but the capacity is not there. There are too many protected sites that need monitoring for the presently existing capacity of people that have the botanical expertise to do floristic quality assessment to deal with. And that's a problem, and that's a capacity we need to build. But we need to develop some tools that a broader range of stewards and stakeholders can implement in the field. Interpretation of floristic quality assessment can also be complicated. And so I go back to this picture. This is a site that had a mean coefficient of conservatism that was rather high, above 4. Had high floristic quality, but so did this site. And the reason for that is this is following some exotic brush removal, but a lot of those woodland species had not yet been extirpated. They were still there and detected. Some of that has to do with the scale of the sampling. So they still get represented. Their cover's just very low. And they're still reasonably conservative species. So the herbaceous stratum here also is in pretty good shape, mean coefficient of conservatism above a 4. But it doesn't give you the resolution to tell that this is maybe more degraded than that previous picture. But that floristic quality does tell you that there's some potential here. There's still some of that conservative flora and maybe an ability there, a capacity with good stewardship for it to stitch itself back together. So in summary, for the need, oak woodlands, especially these most intact remnant sites that have their remnant herbaceous sod, which is not unlike a remnant prairie sod, they're super rare and we need to recognize them. They support rare species, rare and declining species, and they need human interaction for their stewardship. We'll lose them without it. Oak woodland restoration opportunities are often overlooked or misidentified. I come across a lot of occasions where they're misidentified, and that's a waste of really precious conservation dollars and effort and resources, people's time. We need to document baseline conditions and measure progress or failure to progress towards appropriate goals. There are success stories. Unfortunately, we don't have the capacity to do enough monitoring to generate the data to communicate them, and that's a shame. We need to be able to make objective comparisons between sites, and not just their overall quality, but the different ways in which those sites are maybe in good condition or degraded, in terms of their woody structure and in terms of their composition. There aren't enough resources for that fine scale monitoring. The things like floristic quality assessment that take a higher level of botanical expertise to do. We need to be doing those, but we simply don't have the capacity to implement that. So our solution was to develop or adapt coarse level metrics assessments to oak woodlands and develop this monitoring protocol. So our goal was to develop metrics that could be relatively easily assessed. You walk through an oak woodland and it's things that visually the people doing the assessment can see. We wanted to be able to assess baseline conditions and provide useful metrics for people to maybe set restoration goals and track progress. We wanted metrics that could aid in comparison between sites and the particular characteristics of sites that are going to need to be addressed. and how those might match up with capacity when we're generating priorities. We wanted the assessment to be more accessible to stakeholders and stewards of sites. And so it requires general knowledge of oak woodland ecology and plants. And if that level of knowledge is not one that stakeholders and stewards have that are implementing these assessments, they should work towards developing it. It doesn't require the level of botanical expertise that floristic quality assessment does. A foundational principle here is ecological integrity. So an ecological system is able to support and maintain its adaptive biological system, its stability, and is comprised of the full range of parts and processes expected for a region, has ecological integrity. So when we're restoring sites, we're trying to push them back towards a condition where they have ecological integrity. So that's visualized here on the y-axis. And we have degradation by stressors on the x-axis. And we're trying to alleviate those stressors. We're trying to undo the damage done by those stressors when we restore sites. And so we're trying to push them to the left here. And we could rank sites. We could give them letter grades. So A, sites with high ecological integrity, D, sites that are impaired in terms of their ecological integrity. In order to develop assessment tools rooted in ecological integrity, we have to be cognizant of what the drivers of oak woodland composition and structure and sort of all their different facets are. And we have to be aware of the stressors. And so this is a very simplistic conceptual diagram of that for oak woodlands, sort of boiled down to fit on the slide. But these are the sorts of things that are sort of underlying the metrics that we came up with. And I'll highlight fire, though, as a driver, and fire exclusion as a stressor in these systems. And this is from Hanbury and others again. But under regulated anthropogenic application and in conjunction with edaphic and topographic conditions, low severity surface fire was the primary stabilizing mechanism in most open forest systems, our woodlands, and stabilizing, not destabilizing, not something that when implemented these systems have to recover from. It's something that helps these systems perpetuate themselves. So what we're trying to do is distill intact ecological processes and compositional and structural characteristics in that context down into course level metrics that are easily assessed in the field and are not overly redundant with one another, that are mostly separate from one another. How did we develop these? We drafted initial course level metrics with the benefit of assessment tools that had already been developed for oak barrens in Wisconsin and Michigan, and sort of awareness of what the salient stressors and drivers and structural and compositional elements were, and then adapting those to oak woodland systems, literature review, and our professional experience in these systems. We tested draft metrics at several sites during field days and additional sites in the course of our professional work. We pooled data from a bunch of sites, at least 55 from across 7 different ecological landscapes in Wisconsin. So a huge range of sort of different oak woodland types, and looked at what species we were seeing in these historical oak woodland sites that were associated with the highest quality sites or sites that at least had an oak woodland history. The sites we looked at ranged in quality in our assessment from A to D, kind of in terms of that letter grade ranking. So from the highest quality to very impaired. And we adjusted criteria iteratively as we went through this process and visited more sites and got comments from people. So the course level metrics that we came up with are summarized here, and I'm not going to go through them all here. I'll go through them in turn, but they fit into 2 very broad categories, composition and structure. And in quite a few of these cases, those are tied to different stressors and drivers in oak woodlands. So I'll start with the compositional metrics, and the first one is the total percent cover of native graminoids. And there's a canopy cover estimation aid that I'll show you here once, just to give you an idea of what some of these ranges of cover might look like. But the highest quality, least degraded sites have good representation of graminoids in terms of their cover. And so there are a couple images on the left of sites that scored A in this category. And it might be towards the low end if there are a lot of forbs, like the picture on the far left, or even the picture that's second from the left. But the graminoids are still sort of stitched through there. The pictures on the right, the two pictures on the right, are both sites that scored D. The second from the right is a site where the graminoids are thinned out both by excessive shading and excessive leaf litter accumulation. You can see Midland shooting star persisting there because it's ephemeral, so it's going dormant as things get darker later in the season. The site on the far right, it's all native herbaceous vegetation there at ground level, but it is not oak woodland vegetation. It's annuals like three-seeded mercury and clearweed, not graminoids. Those are species that capitalize on nutrient availability that's coming from non-oak and non-sort of old growth herbaceous litter inputs that are fast decomposing and speed up nutrient cycling and prime the decomposition of that oak leaf litter. The number of indicator species, and you have to think about this broadly. These aren't necessarily species that by themselves indicate oak woodland. Some of these are prairie species. Some of these species occur in other wooded communities. Species like pale vetchling, second from the left, broadleaf panic grass, second from the right, and common wood rush are pretty representative of oak woodlands. They occur in oak woodlands across a broad geography and a broad range of soils, and they like that dappled light. But you have species like American Gromwell on the list that maybe are more associated with finer textured soil in oak woodlands, or maybe north slopes, or maybe Short's aster would be another one like that, or world loosestrife and more sandy black oak, white oak woodlands. So the indicator list is not like a potential species list, because there are lots of different types of oak woodlands, and the indicator list is trying to accommodate that broad range to where at a particular site you would fall into this range for the different letter grades of number of indicator species. And some sites that are very high quality meet that 20 plus indicators, even though they don't cover very large areas in terms of their assessment. The next compositional metric is the cover of what we call native degradation indicators. And we didn't use the term disturbance because of its association with fire. When sort of appropriate and good implementation of fire in these systems is stabilizing. It's not a destabilizing disturbance that causes an impact that the system needs to recover from. And a lot of these are species that are native and they occur in oak woodlands and they're part of oak woodland communities, but they become overabundant with different forms of degradation, past land use, fire exclusion, certain types of fire, maybe growing season fire or higher intensity fire. And so that 0 to 20% actually is quite a bit of room for woodland sunflower. But when we start getting really high abundance of these species, they're symptomatic of underlying problems or past problems. The number of parasitic and mycoheterotrophic species, and this includes partially parasitic or hemiparasitic species, and oftentimes high quality oak woodland remnants will have several or at least a few of these, including false toad flax, which we associate with really bright communities and prairies. But it's in really high quality white oak woodlands, it's quite prevalent. Also things like wood betony. But we also have species like the ones on the right, the ghost pipes and the autumn coral root orchid, and they're not just indicating an interaction between two species like all of these are, but they indicate an intact interaction between a plant an actinomycorrhizal fungus, and that fungus and the oak trees. But all of these together, they're chosen as a metric because by their existence at sites, they represent intact ecological interactions, not just the presence of a single species. A more general compositional metric, and a pretty common sense one, is the percent cover of non-native species. So when we get into the structural metrics, we're less concerned with whether or not things are native or non-native. We're dealing with that right here. So if you have a species like, if you have a site like the one on the left, maybe it has more understory woody vegetation than we'd like, but it's all native. So it's an A. That's all hazel and maybe a little rubus and huckleberry and advanced oak regeneration. It's an A in terms of this metric. But the site on the right, that understory woody vegetation is all common buckthorn, exotic. It gets a D. Those sites might score the same in terms of a structural metric that just has to do with a woody stratum. This is where we're calling out native versus non-native vegetation. Another compositional metric is just the representation of white oak group seedlings and saplings. White oak group being mostly white oak and bur oak in these systems, up to 20 feet tall. We've taken out the C category to simplify this a bit. So if they're absent, it's a D. If they're common to occasional, it's an A, and if it's in between, it's a B. And there's more guidance on this separation in the associated procedure document. We have two metrics for sort of the relative cover of white oak group oaks to both red oak group oaks and shagbark hickory kind of combined. And that's because the higher quality sites tend to have more than half white oak, even on coarser textured, sandier soils where it's a white oak, black oak system. Sites that had maybe historical grazing tend to have more white oak, tend to have more black oak and red oak and hills oak sort of in the cohort that comes in with the cessation of grazing, even where the older trees are white oaks. And we could talk about that, but it's sort of a separate discussion. So sites that, like the site on the left, that are more than half white oak are an A. Then we have sites like the one on the right, which they're all oak and shagbark hickory. These are our sort of oak woodland associated trees, or most prevalent trees, but it's sort of out of balance. It's mostly shagbark hickory. It's more than 9-to-1 shagbark hickory to white oak on that site, so it's a D. But both of those sites have really nice herbaceous sods, old growth elements to those sods. And sort of how did it persist in the site on the right? Well, the historical land use there was orchard. So woodland had been cleared for orchard. Orchard was abandoned. It happened to be shagbark hickory that initially colonized and formed much of the canopy, but that land use allowed much of the herbaceous vegetation to persist, and it's really responded well to very frequent dormant, in this case annual, very early spring burning. Then we have sites like that one compared to pictures like the one on the right, and so we have we're trying to separate with this metric sites that have at least the general sort of composition of woodland trees. They have the right trees, but they might be out of balance. So all the oaks and hickory combined relative to other hardwood trees. We had to separate that out. So we want to separate sites that are at least oak hickory, but they're not becoming dominated by trees like American elm and black cherry and black walnut and maples. So like the picture on the right. You'll notice that there still is some room in these metrics in that A category for some minor representation of non-oak and non-shagbark hickory hardwoods, and that's by design because there are some sites where that's an appropriate minor element, and there are other sites where it's not, and this is trying to accommodate that. And that's something that a site steward needs to sort of interpret and adapt this assessment on their own to the particular site conditions. Structural metrics, and sort of starting with that native herbaceous vegetation I mentioned earlier, the least disturbed, highest quality sites tend to have low cover of taller herbaceous vegetation, including native herbaceous vegetation. And so this is meant to be assessed from mid-June onward. A lot of the late flowering stuff has attained most of its height by that time, and then it sort of subsequently develops. It's about knee high, that 2 feet. And in the best sites, they'll have purple Joe pieweed and Culver's root and poke milkweed and other taller things, but the total cover of those things tends to be less than about 10%. Okay, so the sites like the one on the left and the one in the middle would score an A, but sites like the one on the right, where there's just overwhelming taller herbaceous vegetation, score a D. And that's often indicative of past degradation, past thinning out of that sod by shading or past land use like grazing. And it has real implications for ecological process in these systems. It reduces autumnal flammability. That high herbaceous canopy produces a second canopy that stands in the way of that advanced oak regeneration. We have also structural metrics for the different woody strata. So the lowest stratum of woody vegetation is sort of things below 6 feet tall. And it might be a wide variety of things that you see in these systems: low bush honeysuckle, blueberry, huckleberry, American hazel, New Jersey tea. There are a bunch of things that at the highest quality sites, it tends to be less than about 15% cover of those things. 15% is actually quite high when you visualize it. Sites like the picture in the middle are sort of getting into the C range. They have some advanced oak regeneration. That's great, but there's starting to be quite a bit of blackberry or rubus. Sites like the one on the right, if that sort of cover, if that kind of picture extends to much of the site, they're in the D range, where we're getting this extensive and excessive second layer of shading of that herbaceous vegetation, in this case from American hazel and gray dogwood and a little bit of raspberry. Then we have this higher stratum of taller shrubby vegetation or smaller understory trees, and that could be small oaks, could be a few small hickories, could be things like Allegheny serviceberry. What's circled in the background in the picture on the left are hawthorns, Crataegus. And so those may fall in a range of maybe 1 to 10% at the higher quality sites. Again, 10% is actually getting quite high if you actually visualize it. You get much higher than that. We're starting to get a lot of shading from that stratum. What we don't want are sites like the one on the right, which is way more than 30%, and it'd be in the D range, where we're getting so much shading that we essentially don't have herbaceous vegetation anymore beneath. And then sort of the upper stratum, we measure in terms of the canopy closure of the trees. And that's an important distinction. This is not cover. It's not the canopy outlines. The closure is essentially the shading that translates through, the shade patches and flecks that translate through that canopy, those touching canopies, down to the underlying shrubby and herbaceous vegetation. So, picture in your mind that dappled light, and it's the shade portion of that. And we find that even where the overstory is mostly oak, depending on the aspects and depending on the species of oak, white oak, black oak, red oak, and so on, that closure tends to range from about 41 to 65% at the higher quality sites, and the sites that still support a good intact herbaceous vegetation beneath. There are apps for measuring this, so you can take your cell phone into the field and you can capture images. And basically what you're doing is determining whether or not pixels are sky, so blue or gray if it's a cloudy day, versus canopy or limb, brown or green. And you can get calibrate those and get an estimate. And one of those is called canopy cover free, but it's actually giving you closure. And so this image shows a case that's about 70% closure estimated from an app. So it would be a B. It's a little on the high end. There's a little much hickory, which casts a a deeper shade, kind of in the understory in this image. The last metric having to do with structure is leaf litter accumulation. And I'm trying to illustrate this gradient with the pictures. So it's expressed as impedance of the low-statured herbaceous vegetation or plants. And so the picture on the far left, there's a little bit of leaf litter you can see in there, but there's not any significant impedance to that vegetation. But as you go towards the right, you have progressively more and more. And there's more guidance on how to separate these in the procedure document. But as you get more leaf litter, first sort of like in that B range, it's starting to thin out that herbaceous vegetation. And it even more maybe starts to favor those species that have elongating rhizomes or stolons that allow them to rise up through the litter, or maybe taller statured things that can just grow up through the litter. And then the second picture from the right would maybe be a C, where we still have some herbaceous vegetation that's lower in stature. There's still a little bit of thinned out Pennsylvania sedge there. You see one or two, a few little shoots of that. You still see some big leafed aster, but there's quite a bit of impedance. And then you have situations like the far right, which is just this deep leaf litter. And this happens especially at more sharply drained sites, or maybe sites over coarser textured soils, and that leaf litter just doesn't decompose as quickly and has it accumulates to a higher equilibrium. And beneath that, you'll actually get the formation of this organic duff layer, and oak roots and other tree roots and herbaceous plant roots and rhizomes will occupy that duff layer. And that's flammable. And so what happens is these systems become very vulnerable to destabilizing impacts from fire, because they can actually start to cause injury where things are rooted in that duff layer. And so bringing these back is going to be a pretty difficult and delicate process, because we don't want to kill the herbaceous vegetation in the oak trees that persist. What does the field worksheet look like? Well, this is it, and I'll just sort of go through an example here up on top. So with that total percent cover of native graminoids, we have different letter ranks, okay, and we have their different ranges. And so you estimate a cover value, say 15%. That falls in the A range for the letter rank. It's an A, and we translate that to a numerical score. And you do that for every metric in the worksheet. And then for each group of metrics, and you'll see we've broken down composition into two subgroups. The oak woodland composition is more to do with different subsets of the native and especially the herbaceous vegetation. And the general composition is sort of the native versus non, and then what's going on with the oak trees and oak trees relative to other things. And then we have structure down here. Well, you take all of those metrics and you get your letter rank and your score, and then you subtotal those scores, and really it's an average you're taking as a subtotal for each of these groups. You take that average, you multiply it by a weighting factor, and then you add up all of those values to get an overall weighted score for the site and a letter rank for the site overall. But I think the real value here is you get that overall letter rank. You can look back at the individual metrics and figure out what's contributing to that and where sites are impaired. You'll notice we give a lot of weight to this oak woodland composition. Things like the graminoids and the indicators and the partially parasitic mycoheterotrophic species and those degradation indicators give a lot of weight to that herbaceous vegetation in this assessment, or things that are closely tied to that, and that's by design. How do we implement this actually in the field? Well, you want to map your assessment area. You want to know where you're going to go, right? And this should be an area where the restoration target is oak woodland. The best time to do the assessment is from about mid-June into July, when the highest number of indicators are going to be readily identifiable to the most people. There are some things that are easiest to identify earlier or later, but that's when you're going to get the most return on that, especially for people that aren't the highest skill level in terms of their botany. And that vegetative structure, the height of it, knee height and below, is best assessed from mid-June onward. Ideally, a couple people do this so they can talk about the metrics and come to a consensus. It's good to plan your route so that you cover the gradients of aspect or maybe slope percentage or moisture level within the woodland, and capture all of those things, and any maybe gradients of degradation too. So you might plan a rough survey route, and then you calculate your scores on the worksheet. And with experience, you can cover a few or even several assessment areas depending on their size in a day. You should consider this with respect to the timing of management actions. So has the site just been burned, or has there been brush removal work, because that will affect the scores. And that can be valuable because you can see how the scores respond to that and maybe drift back towards where they were originally as time goes on, or not. But if you are doing these assessments at a longer time interval, you might want to hold things like time since last burn constant, so you don't introduce that noise into your data. If you have a big assessment area, there are a number of things of metrics where you're estimating cover, and it might be hard to do that for the whole site. So you can predetermine points along your route to estimate those covers, or you can do that on the fly as you go along your route and estimate cover and take points. But there's a page on the field worksheet that allows you to take sort of estimates as you go along, and then you can take the average of those to fill in the front page. There's this procedure document, and this is just an image of it, and it gives you some general background and then goes through the methods one by one, and gives you guidance on how to implement them. So this is something definitely to read before you just walk out with the field worksheet. So how do we hope people will use this? Well, we hope they'll use it to help differentiate between oak woodlands and other oak communities. So we don't try to shoehorn oak woodlands into open oak savanna restorations, for example. We hope this helps people objectively evaluate quality or ecological integrity based on structure and composition, hopefully in ways that are informed by ecological processes at sites. We hope it helps different sorts of stakeholders get on the same page about just different structural elements and how to communicate about oak woodlands. And we hope it helps people link quality and ecological processes to management, helps them set goals and assess progress over time. I use these not to necessarily guide what goals are in management plans, but how those goals are going to be tracked, and maybe what a long-term goal might be and a subordinate goal what might be. Where can you find this assessment? It's now on the DNR website on the natural community page for oak woodlands. And so the URL is at the bottom, and it's on this additional resources tab. That's what's circled there in yellow. So you'll find it right here. The procedure document, the protocol document, and then the field worksheet. They're both downloadable there. You can also email me. I have it. And if you have questions about implementation, I'm happy to talk with you about it. And it's also available, all this is available on my personal website too. And with that, thank you. And I should have time for a few questions, and I'll be present to answer questions and engage in discussion throughout the rest of the conference.